Everyone thought the rancher had lost her mind when she followed a wild stallion into the wilderness. They called her desperate and delusional. But what she discovered inside that crumbling church changed everything. Don't forget to subscribe and write in the comments where you are watching this video. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Arizona high desert as Catherine "Cat" Brennan stood on the weathered porch of her ranch house, watching the horizon bleed from purple to gold. The coffee in her chipped ceramic mug had gone cold, but she barely noticed. Her eyes traced the familiar contours of the land that had belonged to her family since her great-grandfather had staked his claim here in 1887. The Brennan Ranch wasn't the sprawling empire that some of the corporate operations down in the valley had become. It was modest, 320 acres of stubborn red earth, scattered juniper, and hardy mesquite, supporting a small herd of cattle that had learned to thrive on sparse grazing. Cat had been running the place alone for nearly 5 years now, ever since her father passed and her younger sister moved to Phoenix, declaring she was done with the isolation and endless work of ranch life. At 42, Cat had weathered enough seasons to know that the land demanded everything from those who chose to stay. Her hands bore the scars of barbed wire and rope burn. Her face was lined from decades of sun and wind, and her back carried the permanent ache of a life spent lifting, hauling, and mending. But she had never once considered leaving. This land was in her blood, written into her bones like a language she'd been born speaking. The day began with the usual routine. She fed the horses in the small corral behind the barn, noting that Cisco, her oldest gelding, was favoring his left front leg again. She would need to check that hoof later. She drove the battered pickup truck along the fence line, stopping twice to hammer loose staples back into posts that had shifted in the recent winds. The work was endless, repetitive, the kind that carved grooves into a person's life until the days blurred together in a rhythm of maintenance and survival. By mid-morning, she was checking the water tank in the north pasture when she first saw him. A wild stallion, standing on the rocky outcrop that marked the boundary between her property and the vast stretches of BLM land beyond. He was magnificent, easily 16 hands tall, with a coat the color of burnished copper that gleamed in the sunlight. His black mane whipped in the wind like a battle standard, and even from a distance, she could see the proud arch of his neck, the alert intelligence in his stance. Wild Mustangs weren't uncommon in this part of Arizona. Descendants of Spanish horses that had gone feral centuries ago, they roamed the public lands in small bands, elusive and wary of humans. But this stallion was alone, and he wasn't running. He stood perfectly still, watching her with an intensity that made the hair on the back of her neck prickle. Cat climbed out of the truck slowly, careful not to spook him. She expected him to bolt at any moment. Wild horses didn't linger near humans, didn't stand and stare like domesticated animals waiting for feed. But the stallion remained motionless, his dark eyes locked on hers across the distance. Then, in a movement so deliberate it seemed choreographed, he turned and walked along the ridgeline. Not a trot, not a run, but a measured walk. After 20 paces, he stopped and turned his head, looking directly back at her. Cat felt something shift in her chest, a pull she couldn't name. It was absurd, the idea that this animal was trying to communicate, trying to lead her somewhere. She was a practical woman, raised on early mornings and hard work, not given to flights of fancy or mystical thinking. Yet the stallion's behavior was so purposeful, so unmistakably intentional, that she found herself walking toward him. As she approached, he moved again, maintaining the same careful distance, walking with that same deliberate pace. When she stopped, he stopped. When she continued, he continued. The pattern repeated as he led her away from her truck, away from her land, into the broken country beyond her fence line. The terrain grew rougher with each step. She climbed over weathered volcanic rock, pushed through stands of cholla cactus that snagged at her jeans, and navigated arroyos carved deep by centuries of flash floods. The sun climbed higher, turning the air into a furnace. Sweat soaked through her shirt, and her water bottle was nearly empty. Every practical instinct screamed at her to turn back, to return to her truck, to stop chasing a wild horse into the middle of nowhere. But she didn't stop. Something deeper than logic compelled her forward. The stallion never rushed, never faltered. He moved like he knew exactly where he was going, like he had walked this path 1,000 times before. 2 hours into the journey, Kat crested a low rise and stopped dead in her tracks. Spread before her in a shallow basin she had never seen before, despite having lived her entire life within 15 miles of this spot, stood the ruins of an old church. The structure was small, built from adobe bricks that had eroded back into the earth they came from, its wooden beams bleached white as bones by decades of relentless sun. The roof had partially collapsed inward, and what remained of the walls stood like broken teeth against the sky. A wooden cross, split down the middle and listing at a dangerous angle, still clung to the front facade. The stallion walked directly to the church's entrance, where a door hung crooked on one remaining hinge, then turned to look at her one final time. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and then he wheeled and galloped away, disappearing into the desert scrub like smoke dissolving in wind. Kat stood alone in the silence, staring at the impossible structure before her. She had explored these public lands as a teenager, had ridden every canyon and ridge within a day's journey of the ranch. How had she never known this church existed? How had no one ever mentioned it? The sensible choice would have been to turn back. The building was clearly unsafe, its structure compromised by time and weather. She had work waiting at the ranch, cattle to check, fences to mend. But the same force that had pulled her across those 2 hours of desert now drew her toward the entrance. She stepped carefully through the doorway, ducking beneath the sagging lintel. The interior was dim and cool, a blessed relief from the hammer of the sun outside. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed by her entrance, swirling in the shafts of light that penetrated through gaps in the roof. Broken pews lay scattered across the floor like fallen dominoes. They would split and gray with age. The plaster on the walls had crumbled away in great chunks, revealing the adobe beneath. Animal nests filled the corners, and the floor was carpeted with decades of wind-blown sand and debris. At first, the space appeared to hold nothing but ruin and abandonment. But as Kat's eyes adjusted to the dimness, she noticed something unusual near what had once been the altar area. The floor there looked different, disturbed in a way that suggested recent activity rather than gradual decay. The dirt had been moved, smoothed, as though something had been buried or unearthed. Driven by curiosity, she knelt and began brushing away the loose soil with her hands. Her fingers struck something solid. Wood. She dug more urgently now, uncovering the edge of what appeared to be a wooden crate. With effort, she pried it free from the earth. The crate was old but well-constructed, sealed with a simple latch that had rusted but still functioned. Kat's hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth that had protected them from moisture and decay, were documents. Yellowed paper covered in careful, feminine handwriting. Letters, journals, sketches, and maps drawn in fading ink. She lifted the first document into a shaft of sunlight and began to read. The handwriting was elegant, precise, belonging to someone educated and meticulous. As she scanned the pages, her breath caught in her throat. These were the personal records of Dr. Miriam Ashford, a physician who had come to this valley in 1891. The letters detailed her journey west from Boston, her determination to practice medicine on the frontier despite the opposition she faced as a woman in a male-dominated profession. The journal entries spoke of establishing a clinic in this very church, treating miners, ranchers, and indigenous people who had nowhere else to turn. But it was what came next that made Kat's pulse quicken. Dr. Ashford had developed innovative treatments for the diseases that plagued the frontier, methods of sanitation and wound care that were decades ahead of their time. She had saved countless lives during a typhoid outbreak, using techniques that wouldn't become standard medical practice until the 1920s. Yet according to her final journal entries, written in an increasingly desperate hand, the community had turned against her. They called her methods unnatural, accused her of witchcraft and devilry. The local minister had denounced her from the pulpit. Men had threatened her life. And finally, in the winter of 1894, she had been forced to flee, abandoning the church and everything she had built. The final letter was addressed to whoever finds this. In it, Dr. Ashford wrote that she had buried her records in the hope that someday someone would discover them and understand that she had only tried to help, that her work had been driven by compassion and science, not darkness. She hoped history would remember her truthfully. Kat sat back on her heels, holding the fragile papers with reverence. This was more than historical curiosity. This was the story of a woman who had been brilliant, brave, and punished for both. A woman whose contributions had been deliberately erased, whose very existence had been wiped from local memory. She carefully returned the documents to their protective wrapping and carried the crate outside. The sun was already beginning its descent toward the western horizon. She had been in the church longer than she realized. The journey back to her truck would take hours, and she would be navigating in twilight. When Kat finally reached her ranch as the last light faded from the sky, she was exhausted, dehydrated, and covered in dust. But clutched against her chest was the crate, and burning in her mind was the certainty that she had found something that mattered. She told no one that night. She cleaned up, tended to her animals, and sat at her kitchen table studying the documents by lamplight until her eyes burned with fatigue. She wanted to understand everything before she spoke to anyone. But secrets don't keep in small communities. By the next afternoon, when she drove into the nearby town of Copper Springs for supplies, half the population seemed to know that Kat Brennan had spent an entire day chasing a wild horse into the desert. The story had already transformed in the telling, acquiring embellishments and mockery with each retelling. At the hardware store, Jake Morrison, who had gone to high school with her sister, grinned as she walked in. "Hey, Kat, heard you went on a spirit quest yesterday. The wild horses sharing their ancient wisdom with you now." The other men in the store chuckled. One called out, "Maybe she's trying to start her own Mustang sanctuary. Gonna talk him all into being friendly." Kat ignored them, collected the fence wire she needed, and moved to the counter. But the ridicule followed her. At the diner, where she stopped for coffee, the waitress, Linda Chun, leaned in with a sympathetic expression. "Honey, are you doing okay out there by yourself? People are saying you wandered off yesterday, following a horse. Well, that's concerning. Maybe you should think about visiting someone, a counselor or something. Isolation can do funny things to a person's mind." Kat tried to explain. "I found something. An old church, hidden out past the BLM land. There were documents, records from." But Linda had already stopped listening, her eyes soft with pity. "Sure, honey. Sure you did. You just take care of yourself, okay?" The dismissal stung worse than outright mockery. By Sunday, the story had spread through the entire valley. At the small community church in Copper Springs, where Kat occasionally attended services, people whispered as she entered. She caught fragments of conversations. "Poor woman. All alone out there. Grief does strange things." Saw her talking to herself at the feed store. Her neighbor, Bill Hastings, who ran the ranch adjacent to hers, stopped by Monday morning with concern etched across his weathered face. "Kat, I heard some things. About you chasing wild horses, claiming you found some old building that doesn't exist. I've ridden every inch of that country for 40 years. There's nothing out there but rocks and rattlesnakes." She tried to show him the documents, but he waved them away without looking. "Old papers don't prove anything. Could have come from anywhere. You're working yourself too hard, Kat. Running this place alone, it's too much. Maybe it's time to think about selling, moving closer to town where there are people around." Even her own sister called that evening, her voice tight with worry. "Kat, people are talking. They think you're losing it. Following animals, seeing buildings that aren't there. This isn't like you. I think you need to come stay with me for a while, get away from that ranch." Kat tried to explain about Dr. Ashford, about the historical significance of what she'd found. But her sister cut her off. "You're not thinking clearly. Isolation has gotten to you. Promise me you'll see someone." The mockery intensified with each passing day. At the weekly Cattlemen's Association meeting, men she'd known her entire life made jokes about her imaginary church and asked if the Mustangs had appointed her as their prophet. Teenagers in town started neighing when she walked past, then dissolving into laughter. The local newspaper ran a human interest piece about the challenges of isolation in rural areas, and though it didn't name her, everyone knew who they meant. But Kat endured it all in silence. Each night, she returned to the documents, studying them by lamplight, learning everything she could about Dr. Miriam Ashford. She photographed every page, researched medical history to verify the techniques described, traced property records to confirm the church's location. The more she learned, the more convinced she became that this discovery was important. Dr. Ashford hadn't just been a competent frontier physician. She had been a pioneer whose work had been deliberately buried by prejudice and fear. The valley could laugh all they wanted. Kat Brennan had spent her entire life being underestimated, being told what she couldn't do as a woman running a ranch alone. She knew the weight of mockery, and she knew how to carry it. The wild stallion had led her to something that mattered, and she would not let Dr. Ashford be forgotten again, no matter how many people called her crazy. In the quiet of her ranch, surrounded by ridicule, Kat made her decision. She would prove the church existed. She would validate Dr. Ashford's work. And she would show them all that sometimes the things people dismiss as madness are actually the most important truths of all. The stallion never appeared again. But she didn't need him to. He had already shown her what the world had tried to erase. The weeks following Kat's discovery settled into a rhythm that felt both familiar and strange. Each morning, she rose before dawn to tend the ranch, moving through routines that had defined her life for decades. She fed the horses, checked the cattle, mended fences that wind and wildlife tested constantly. But now, every moment of physical labor was accompanied by thoughts of Dr. Miriam Ashford and the abandoned church that held her secrets. Each evening, as the desert heat finally broke and the sky turned the color of bruised plums, Kat returned to the documents. She had converted her father's old office into a makeshift research station, covering the desk with carefully organized papers, photographs she'd taken of the church, and notes compiled from cross-referencing historical records. The deeper she dug, the more substantial Dr. Ashford's story became. She discovered that Miriam Ashford had graduated from the Women's Medical College of Pennsylvania in 1889, one of only a handful of institutions that would train female physicians. She had come west not from desperation, but from conviction, believing frontier communities needed medical care regardless of who provided it. The journal entries revealed a woman of extraordinary courage, treating gunshot wounds, delivering babies in primitive conditions, and fighting disease with limited supplies and even less support. But the Valley's reaction to Kat's ongoing interest hardened into something more cutting. At the feed store, conversations stopped when she entered, replaced by knowing looks and barely suppressed smiles. Men who had once treated her as an equal now spoke to her with careful gentleness reserved for the fragile and confused. "How's that ghost church of yours, Kat?" Tommy Sullivan asked one morning, his tone dripping with false concern. "The Mustangs tell you any more secrets?" The other men chuckled, but there was an edge to it now. They weren't just amused anymore. They were genuinely worried she had lost her grip on reality. At the post office, Martha Rodriguez pulled Kat aside with a troubled expression. "Honey, I've known you since you were a little girl. Your daddy would be worried sick if he saw you like this. Chasing after wild horses, spending all your time digging through old papers. Maybe you should talk to someone." Kat tried to explain, tried to show Martha the documents, the photographs, the evidence she'd compiled. But Martha just patted her hand and shook her head sadly. "Those could be from anywhere, dear. The mind can play tricks when we're lonely." Elena Santos, who ran the small cafe and had shared countless conversations with Kat over the years, now watched her with wary eyes. "People are starting to talk about whether you're safe, whether someone should check on you more often." The implication hung in the air. They were questioning her competency, her sanity, her ability to care for herself. Kat's sister called every few days, each conversation following the same painful pattern. "You need to let this go. You're embarrassing yourself. People think you've had some kind of breakdown." The isolation deepened. Invitations to community events dried up. The Cattlemen's Association stopped calling about meetings. Even casual encounters in town became strained, people making excuses to cut conversations short. But Kat pressed on. She made multiple trips back to the church, documenting every detail, measuring dimensions, photographing construction techniques. She researched property records at the county courthouse, finding oblique references to a medical station established in 1891. She contacted historical societies, museums, anyone who might have information about frontier medicine or female physicians in Arizona. Each rejection stung, but Kat refused to give up. She spent evenings carefully transcribing Dr. Ashford's journals, preserving every word, every observation, every case study. She created detailed maps showing the church's location. She compiled a chronology of Dr. Ashford's time in the valley, cross-referencing it with newspaper archives and territorial records. The physical toll began to show. She lost weight, her clothes hanging looser. Dark circles appeared under her eyes from late nights spent reading by inadequate lamplight. Her neighbor Bill Hastings stopped by one evening, his expression grave. "Cat, you're running yourself into the ground. The ranch is starting to show it too. Your fence line is down on the eastern section. You can't keep this up." He wasn't wrong. Cat had let some maintenance slide, consumed by the research. But she couldn't explain that every hour away felt like betraying Dr. Ashford all over again. "This isn't about the fence," Bill continued. "This is about you losing yourself in something that doesn't matter. Whatever you think you found, it's not worth destroying yourself over." That night, Kat stood on her porch watching the sunset paint the desert in copper and gold. She thought about Dr. Ashford, alone in that church over a century ago, fighting to save lives while the community turned against her. She thought about the diary's final entry: "I have done no wrong. History will prove it, though I may not live to see that day." But as autumn deepened, something else began happening in Copper Springs. The wells started to fail. It began subtly. A few ranchers mentioned their wells running lower than usual. Then Bill Hastings reported his well had gone completely dry, forcing him to truck in water at considerable expense. Within 2 weeks, 3 more ranches reported similar problems. The town well began producing water with an odd metallic taste and faint discoloration. County testing showed elevated minerals and potential contamination from old mining operations. The water was technically safe, but barely, and the levels were trending worse. Panic rippled through the community. This was high desert country, where water meant survival. Without reliable wells, ranches couldn't sustain livestock. Families couldn't stay in their homes. The entire valley's economy depended on groundwater access, and that access was failing. Emergency meetings were called. The Cattlemen's Association gathered. The town council brought in hydrologists and engineers. Everyone had theories: drought conditions, shifting geology, contamination from abandoned mines. The mood was grim, edging toward desperate. Kat attended one community meeting, sitting quietly in back while neighbors argued and worried. She listened as they discussed expensive solutions: drilling deeper wells, trucking in water, applying for emergency state assistance. And in that desperation, Kat saw something she recognized. She saw the same fear that must have gripped the valley during the 1893 typhoid outbreak that had brought Dr. Ashford here. She thought about journal entries describing how the doctor had solved water contamination problems, how she had identified sources and implemented solutions that saved lives. Dr. Ashford's notes contained detailed observations about the valley's hydrology, about underground water sources, about old mining operations, and how they affected water quality. She had mapped the aquifer system with remarkable accuracy, identified safe water sources, and documented purification methods revolutionary for her time. The answer to the valley's current crisis might be buried in those journals. Dr. Ashford had understood this land's water systems better than anyone since. But how could Kat convince anyone? She was already seen as delusional. If she suggested their modern crisis's solution lay in journals of a doctor most believed she'd invented, they would dismiss her completely. She remained silent, watching, waiting. The same patience that had carried her through years of running the ranch alone now told her the right moment would come. That night, Kat spread Dr. Ashford's maps across her kitchen table alongside modern topographical maps. She began comparing them, looking for patterns the doctor had identified, checking them against current well failure locations. What she found made her heart race. Dr. Ashford had been right. The aquifer system was more complex than modern surveys suggested, with multiple underground streams that could be contaminated by old mining operations. And according to the doctor's notes, there were alternative water sources, springs and seeps that could be developed that had sustained indigenous populations for centuries. Kat worked through the night, correlating Dr. Ashford's observations with current geological data, creating a presentation combining historical research with modern analysis. The valley was in crisis, and she alone held the key to understanding it. The wild stallion had led her to Dr. Ashford for a reason. The forgotten doctor's work was about to become vitally, urgently relevant. Whether they believed her or not, Kat Brennan was about to step out of the shadows.